All right, now let's get analysis on this case. We are now joined by teams by legal analyst Mpumelelo Zikalala. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Now, this is a very, complicated case. There are so many elements and moving parts, and I want you to help us unpack them. Advocate Thabani Masuku arguing that meeting in 2021 to appoint King Misuzulu KaZwelithini did not follow age-old AmaZulu traditions and customs. How do you foresee this case playing itself out, just bearing all of those elements that are at play? And is this reasonable grounds of bringing such an application?
There are basically two sources which are going to be questioned here. The first one pertaining to the current legislative processes that we have in terms of the Traditional Leadership and Caution Act. Did you have a meeting? Did the meeting correct? Was it sufficient for all the individuals to be there? Were proper democratic processes also observed so that every single house has a view in terms of which of the particular members are going to be eligible and must be selected to be the next CCLO? But the most important one is going to be this one. When it comes to the customs and rituals which are performed by the Zulu nation and also by the Zulu family, which of those customs were followed, which of those customs were not followed? That is going to be a bit of a difficult one because all these customs are not codified in any manner. So it's very difficult to go back and say it is this legislation of this particular process that ought to have been followed in this certain instances. So it's going to be very crucial for the court to then go back and say, which are we going to rely on when it comes to the element of compliance? What are we going to look at when it comes to certain things in which are going to be used in determining who is the rightful owner or rightful person that should be attached to this particular throne? But what you did say today, though, from the submission of the president was the raising of technical questions or technical submissions. The first one of saying that, well, this matter has been decided before by Judge Madondo. Why are we here today? If a person was aggrieved by those particular outcomes that came out of the judgment, even though the core substance was not pertaining to the seat of CCLO, then that person should have appealed that particular judgment. They've elected not to do so, despite both the applicants that are there, that is Prince Simakade and the Prince Mbonisi being part of the applicants or the persons that were all included in the previous occasion.
And I'm glad you mentioned the president, and I want us to talk about, where does this leave him? And of course, speak to his role in all of this. I mean, his role typically comes in towards the end of the process, I understand. The president conceded, as you rightfully said, that he relied on Justice Madondo's judgment when he issued a certificate of appointment to King Misuzulu.
And the president also adding and saying, and by the way, there may have been people that have been concerned, but there was no official complaint which was led to my office. So there was no need for me to even say there must be an investigating process which is going to be there. Now, what I have as a president to determine whether I'm making a correct decision, yes or no, is the following. Submissions that are coming from the Prime Minister of the Zulu Nation. I then have that recommendation panel which was set up and headed by the former Premier, Mr. Mbonisi, and all the other evidence which is available at my disposal, including the judgment, of which the judgment is very crucial in terms of saying, yes, that particular points may have come during what we call within a judgment an obiter. However, it was nonetheless a ruling, a determination of a dispute of facts, and or something that would have been challenged if there are certain individuals that were not happy about it.
But of course, those that are opposing it, the royal family, saying that, the president was irrational. In fact, also saying that the process to elect the king was flawed. And I want you to talk about just some of the parts that they are also bringing in, the fact of no identification process that took place. And of course, to what extent does, the Zulu customary laws or even norms, fit in all of this?
I think the first one is to say to the president, Mr. President, when you take decisions, you must make absolutely sure that those decisions are correct. In this instance, you did not even question as to whether that meeting corrected, who formed part of that meeting. If that's the case, where's the portfolio of evidence that would later determine as these are the individuals that ought to have attended? Are you absolutely sure that anyone that ought to be made part of that meeting attended the meeting and also participated in a proper manner? If you haven't done so, then on what basis are you drawing the rationality of the decision that you have taken? Despite the fact that you have all the tools which are available to you to authenticate whatever submissions that have been made to you, you haven't done that. All that you have done is to rely on a judgment that has been issued by Judge Madondo. And by the way, on that particular application, the core matter, the core bone of contention of that particular judgment was not about the kingship, but was about the will, which was later disposed in whatever manner in which it was disposed.
And just talk to us about, Advocate Moirani, of course, the President's counsel, also emphasizing that Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi at the time was recognized by Judge Madondo as a relevant person to deal with the installation of the Zulu king due to his seniority, of course, as well as his title as the traditional Zulu Prime Minister. To what extent does this hold?
It would hold to a certain extent, especially when you are dealing with content which has not been codified. So there's no legislation that we can go to and ask in selecting the next isilo. What are the requirements and things that ought to be followed? What is the procedure that ought to be followed so that you make sure that you've got the correct individual who's going to be isilo of AmaZulu? So in that case, the only thing that you can do is to go back and say, of the people that are surviving, who would call people who are knowledgeable or ingwele, let's ask them, how do you go about pertaining to this particular matter? Now, the late Prince would have been the most appropriate person to do so. He's presided over this process before. It is not the first time in which he would have done so, and he certainly knows the ins and outs of it, despite the fact that it hasn't been codified in any manner. So when it comes to the credibility of the information that is coming with, I think that there's little room when it comes to anyone who's going to dispute the accuracy of what he would have said or what it would have suggested in terms of the process that ought to be followed when selecting the next seal.
Because there's so much ambiguity, and in the event the court does found that in fact this process was flawed, what's likely to happen?
There are two things that might happen. The first one is that the court may come to the conclusion to say, well, we are going to substitute one person with another, or, which is very rare, by the way. The court does not like to be the decision maker when it comes to this type of processes. They would rather say, the only thing that you are going to fault is the process. Let's take it back to the decision maker and allow the decision maker to take full responsibility of their decisions. Discretionary processes must be utilized by the correct individual. So in this case, it's the royal family that will go back and decide how things ought to be. Now, we've had submissions that have been made by, I think, Princess Simakade, if I'm not mistaken, by saying, well, Mr. President, there's already a dispute that is there. Rather than sending it back to the family, please create this investigative committee. And the act is quite clear as to what's going to be composed of that investigative committee, and allow us to make submissions within that particular committee. And it's only that committee which is going to recommend individuals who are a person that can then be regarded as the next seal. So the court is likely to say that if his application is approved, in terms of saying, go back to the family, let the investigative committee to conduct itself, or we order the president to create this investigation committee, and based on the results, that's when we're going to determine who the next seal is going to be.
Mpumelelo, thank you so much, as usual, for your analysis. Mpumelelo Zikalala is a legal analyst there, just unpacking what is currently transpiring before the courts. Of course, Prince Simakade Zulu is challenging the validity of the appointment of Zulu King Misuzulu KaZwelithini as the heir to the throne of the Zulu nation.